let's talk about what are called rational numbers. To begin with, we're going to start by filling in some number lines. If we needed to add the missing numbers to this top number line, we could simply count by ones. So we would have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is what we call natural numbers as well as counting numbers. They mean the same thing. For our second number line, this time we started 0. So we could then count by ones and fill in and the rest of this number line. And of course it would continue on and on. We call these whole numbers. The only difference between natural and counting numbers is that whole numbers include 0. For this next set of numbers, I have 0 in the center of the number line. So to the right of the number line would be a +1, a +2, and so on. To the left of the number line would be a -1 and a -2, which is in a mirror reflection to the positive side. We refer to these as integers. This last number line has some interesting things happening with it. We see 0 there, but then we also see some longer and shorter lines. Well, the longer lines are going to represent numbers that are without a fraction or a decimal. So this first long line to the right of the 0 would represent a +1, and the next one would represent a +2. So we have to think about what it is that would come between 0 and 1 exactly in the middle. Well, that could be 0.5 as a decimal or 1/2 as a fraction. Just like to the right of the 2, we could have 2.5 as a decimal or 2.5 as a fraction. On the left side of the number line, the left of the 0, we're going to work opposite in a mirror reflection of the positive side. So as we slide over, we see this long line, which is going to represent a -1. The next long line would represent a -2. So we have to think about what would come in between. Well, that would be a -1.5 or -1 and 1/2. The little short line that comes after the 2 would represent -2.5 or -2 and 1/2. We refer to these numbers as rational numbers. Let's look at some better definitions of what those numbers really are. First, we're going to look at some number lines to kind of get a feel for these. Number 1, if you look back at those number lines, is a part of natural numbers, it's a part of whole numbers, it's a part of integers, and it's a part of rational numbers, because we see that number 1 would be represented on all of those number lines. 0, on the other hand, was not a part of the natural numbers. It was only on the number line starting with whole numbers, and then on integers as well as rational. If our number lines continued even further, with -3, we would see that those were on the integer and the rational number lines. They would not be included on the natural and the whole number lines. 2.5, since it has a fraction, would only be on the rational number line, as well as -1.5, because it has a decimal, would only be on the rational number line. So what exactly are these numbers? We're getting closer. I want you to think about a map of the United States and think about how you can relate rational numbers to these locations on the map. They do correspond. Think about rational numbers. Think about how many are on rational numbers compared to how many numbers are on the natural counting numbers. Well, if you think about these map locations, you'll find that the smallest, most specific would be Alamo Heights. So that would be like our natural numbers. If we were to move a step up in our thinking after Alamo Heights, one that would include more numbers would be like San Antonio, which would be our whole numbers. It's got a little bit more, not a lot, but a little bit more. And then from there, our next map location that would include an additional amount of people, an additional amount of numbers, if you will, would be Texas. And then the greatest amount that includes everybody would be the United States. So what exactly are these numbers? Well, natural, which we also call counting numbers, are the numbers that you naturally count with. These are the numbers that if you were counting Skittles in a bag, that you would count with. You would start with 1, of course, and increase from there. Whole numbers, on the other hand, begin with 0 and increase by 1. These numbers are always the number 0 or positive numbers. Whole numbers are never negative. Integers include the set of whole numbers and their opposites. These are never decimals, and they are never fractions. I'm going to take that back. They are never decimals, but they can, I'm going to put a decimal here and I'm going to take this out. They can be fractions that can be divided into whole numbers. For example, if we have 14 over 2, this really means 14 divided by 2, which is 7. So since 14 over 2 simplifies to 7, that could be an integer. Rational numbers include natural numbers, whole numbers, integers, along with fractions and decimals that either end or repeat. The decimals have to come to an end, they have to repeat. They cannot be decimals that go on forever and never end. Irrational numbers, on the other hand, is when a number that is divided that never ends and it never repeats. So there's no pattern to it. A good example of this is the number pi, which some of you know is that 3.14, and it goes on and on forever. It never ends and it never repeats. There's no pattern to it. These are the types of numbers in our number system.